everybody. Hello, I'm Isabel Hunter. I'm the Chief Executive of Libraries Connected. So I'm really, really pleased to welcome you to the third webinar in our series of Black Lives Matter webinars. I'll just do a tiny bit of housekeeping first. We've admitted everybody and you're all on mute at the moment so we don't get background noise and echoes. Please do start typing comments into the chat box. We'll start when we get to the discussion session later. We'll start trawling the chat box for comments and questions. So at that point, we might invite you to unmute yourself and to ask your question. We are recording the event and we'll publish that later on our YouTube channel and website. So if you don't want to appear on the recording, you'll only appear when you're speaking. The recording just records the speaker. But if you want to ask a question without speaking or without appearing, then you can just type it in and we can ask it for you. But otherwise, you'll appear on the screen at that moment. So I think I don't have to do a 5-exit, another kind of housekeeping on an event like this, do I? So this series has been really, really fascinating. So far. We're really grateful to the speakers who've joined us so far and set up such searching discussions around the initial two themes where we looked at book selection and the whole publishing ecology. We also looked at language and libraries' role in educating about anti-racism. And also, I just want to say a massive thank you to the audience who's been involved in these events, because they've really, really engaged with the themes and they ensured the discussion really took off each time in, really, really interesting directions. And we don't want these webinars just to be interesting hour of discussion. We really want them to inform our work at Libraries Connected and to change the way we do and the way we work with the library sector. So the first two are helping us shape this major programme of work we're starting to develop around books and reading, because books and reading are absolutely at the core of libraries' work. So in the discussion today, please don't hold back. We do need that challenge as a library sector body, and the library sector needs a challenge. That's the way that we're going to look clearly at changes that need to be made. So today our theme is understanding our past. And this is obviously a theme which has been, really, really in the headlines since the events in Bristol and the removal of the Joseph Colton statue. I'm actually an archivist rather than a librarian by training. So I've been struck by the fact that the archive, museum and heritage sector has been engaged in really serious debate about interpretation and representation for 1 or 2 decades now, and how much things have progressed since I qualified as an archivist back in 1990. So when I qualified, there was this fundamental principle that was pressed upon us that the archivist is a neutral actor in the historical process. But I'm very pleased to say that principle has been roundly challenged in the decades since 1990. And now, there's much more understanding about that role of the archivist in selecting what should be preserved in the archive, how is it interpreted, who can access it. That whole process has been laid bare now. And it's certainly not a neutral role at all. That the archivist really does shape those raw materials of history. Practice in the archive will certainly still got a long way to go, but there have been great steps forward in developing reinterpretation methodologies, in developing community engagement practices so that collecting and development of collections is more representative. And there's also been a lot of work on the use of language and terminology in cataloguing. But public libraries don't seem to have been... Oh, top over. Whoops, sorry, I had my laptop propped up and I, sorry. So public libraries don't seem to have been part of this debate across the heritage world. Maybe that's because public libraries focus very much on the present and the future. They focus on helping individuals now in ways that can help them build a better future life. So book stock is managed as a flowing river rather than as a static collection to be preserved. And yet, of course, our present and future is shaped by our past and our understanding of our past. And furthermore, public libraries do contain a lot of historic materials, local history collections that are fundamental to how communities understand and talk about themselves, archive collections that celebrate significant people and organisations in that area or nationally. And library shelves are full of literature from past eras. So libraries are in and of their communities. And it's time to start thinking more clearly about the role they need to play in helping people to understand the past. But I'm very pleased today to welcome two speakers who are really generously sharing their insights into this topic with us today. So we have Rhode Boateng, who's the archive supervisor at the Black Cultural Archives in London. And we also have Professor Carolyn Betensky, Associate Professor of English, who's joining us from University of Rhode Island over in the States. So firstly, Rhoda, could I invite you to speak and to talk a little about the work of the Black Cultural Archives?
Yeah, of course. So I was just going to share a short presentation just to kind of go into detail about Black Cultural Archives and the work that we do. So I'm just going to, could you, Isabel, make me a co-host so I could share my screen? Or maybe that's Robert who could do that.
Isabel, could you make Rhoda a co-host, please?
Oh, sorry, yes. Wait, you might have to talk me through it, Robert. Sorry, everybody.
I think we go to participants and then...
Okay, I've got it now. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I'm terrible at this stuff. Do you want to change the host?
Oh, great.
Yes. Okay.
All right.
The host now.
Thank you. Okay. Let me share my screen. View. Yeah, I'm still getting used to Zoom. It's been months and months, but it's still, I still struggle intensely. So I'm Rhoda. I'm the archive supervisor at Black Cultural Archives. And I just wanted to introduce BCA and our history and the work that we do. So BCA was founded in 1981. And it kind of grew from a response to a number of different events that were kind of happening in the UK. So some events include the New Cross Massacre of 1981 and the Brixton Uprisings of 1981, and also the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984. So our founders were kind of in a period of real upheaval in the UK, a lot of racial tensions, and a lot of kind of tensions between Black communities in the UK and the state were really coming to a head. And our founders kind of thought that what was needed was a space where members of the community could find themselves, and a space where people could see positive representation of people of African and Caribbean descent in the UK, and a place where their kind of contributions to history and culture would be recognised. So this act of self-help kind of expanded into the creation of what our founders call an archive museum. And we're an archive, but we do hold museum collections also. And the idea was to paint a more comprehensive picture of Black presence in Britain. So for us, the value of archiving is really rooted in this mission to redress the historic erasure of Black people in archives and museums, and also in libraries in the UK. And I think this quote by our founder, Len Garrison, really sums up our approach, which is somebody has to go out and collect it and rescue it, retrieve it, preserve it and protect it. So that's kind of our guiding principles. So our collections policy is to have primary focus on the histories and stories of Black people in Britain since the Second World War. So most of our collections are very modern, kind of going from the sort of post-Windrush period of 1948 onwards. And they kind of include not only the presence of African and Caribbean people in Britain, but they also relate back to the Caribbean and Africa and kind of other places across the diaspora. And that's actually most seen in our library collections. So although our archive focuses on the contributions of Black people in Britain, our library collections are slightly more expanded. So BCA started as a community archive, amassed over many years. So in the early days of BCA, it was literally our founders kind of going to auctions and secondhand bookshops and other places like that to kind of find as much material as they could that would kind of evidence that people of African and Caribbean descent have been in the UK and have been contributing to history and culture. So over time, and with the help of trained archivists and volunteers, the collection was catalogued and contextualised, and is kind of constantly being added to and expanded. But it does still remain very heavily rooted in the community that created it. We're a national organisation, so we collect from across the UK, but our home is in Brixton, and the history of Brixton and South London is like very fundamental to us as an organisation. So in our archive collections, we hold different personal and organisational papers. So the archive collection has over 3,500 records across 41 collections. And as far as personal and organisational papers, our kind of biggest collections are our own organisation's archive. So it kind of charts the progression of BCA from being, a seed in our founder's mind to our permanent home in Brixton now. We also hold the collections of the Runnymede Trust. So the Runnymede Trust are the UK's leading independent race equality think tank, and they've been working for over 4 decades to promote like a successful multi-ethnic Britain. We also hold the collections of like smaller community organisations. So an example of that would be the records of Pagnell Street Youth and Community Centre. So we also hold the collections of organisations that don't currently exist, but are very kind of like crucial in charting the kind of histories of race activism in the UK. So this is some examples of the kind of material we have. So we've got a large Black dancers archive, for instance. So this is like a collection of different records from organisations who are like leading in Black dance in the UK. We also hold the collections of lots of different activists. So BCA kind of really grew out of a network of activists and parents. So people who were very much kind of doing grassroots work, and were also very much concerned with how not only the kind of the current generation of Black people in the UK were being treated, but kind of what evidence there was going to be for, future generations of Black children who were going to grow up in the UK. So this is some material from Cecil Gutsmore, who was really instrumental in kind of organising after the Brixton uprisings in 1981. So this is some material from the Brixton Defence Campaign, which was like an organised effort to kind of help out people who had been caught up in the uprisings and people who were kind of facing police repercussions. We also have the papers of other activists such as Stella Deadsy. So Stella was really instrumental in the Black women's movement in the UK in the late 70s and 1980s. And her collection kind of features the works of different organisations, most notably the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent, OWAD, who are a kind of really fundamental group in overturning what we know to be the histories of like feminist organising in the UK. We also hold the papers and collections around different cultural figures of African descent. So we've got a very large collection of Samuel Coleridge Taylor's sheet music, and also other ephemera to do with him. And this collection is actually like, it represents like a really kind of early collecting style for BCA, because most of the records are literally things that our founders were kind of finding in auctions and places like that, and kind of amassing it together. And now it's one of the largest collections on Samuel Coleridge Taylor in the UK. We also have a really large collection of oral histories. So BCA sees oral histories as being really, really crucial for recording the stories of people of African and Caribbean descent in the UK. And it kind of continues a lineage of oral traditions across Africa and the Caribbean. So all of these oral history collections are available to listen to in our reading room and library. So they're collections that you don't have to book in advance. You can kind of come and browse our library shelves and also listen to these oral histories. And it's quite important for kind of having that subjective view of history, kind of similarly to what Isabel was talking about in the start, and thinking about the archivist and also archive collections as not being neutral spaces at all. For us, oral history is really important because it centres personal testimony and personal experience. So some oral history collections we have are a very large collection called The Heart of the Race, which is connected to the Black women's movement. We've also got interviews by internationally renowned photographers. So that was like a big collecting project in conjunction with the V&A. We have interviews of different activists, most notably interviews of people in the Black Panther Party in the UK. And we also have multiple collections of Windrush interviews. So those are interviews kind of like under the banner of that post-war period of migration. And again, that's really crucial because, thinking about what's going on now with the Windrush scandal and the kind of continued prejudice that generation have faced, we think it's really important to have a place where you can kind of come and hear personal testimonies and personal stories and kind of put, names and experiences to this Windrush banner. We also hold a large collection of publications and periodicals. So we have over 100 titles, and those are titles from BCA's collection, but also from the Runnymede Trust collection. So they kind of range from national, like very famous titles like The Voice, to the publications of smaller organisations which may not exist today, but their publications contain really vital information about activities and issues of great historical importance. So to kind of spotlight the different range of publications and periodicals we have on the screen now, on the left-hand side, we've got Grassroots Newspaper. So that's a publication from the Black Liberation Front, who were working in the late 70s and early 80s, doing a lot of grassroots organising around racial justice in the UK. And you can kind of contrast that with one of the earliest items in our collection, which is an antique newspaper by the Edinburgh Evening Courant. And all of our antique newspapers contain articles that relate to Black history in some way. And because of the period of time, they mainly relate towards the transatlantic slave trade. So in this issue of the Edinburgh Evening Courant, there's kind of an article about an uprising of enslaved peoples from a slave ship. So there's a real vastness in this range of publications and periodicals, but like foregrounding resistance always. BCA also has a very large ephemera collection, and this is like another area of collecting that's really unique to BCA. And ephemera is, like one-term or short-term use items, so like greeting cards or posters or leaflets or flyers. And ephemera is really important to us because it creates a snapshot of activity at any given time. And it also really highlights the contributions of people of African descent culturally, kind of across the UK. And it creates a record of materials that might otherwise be forgotten. So some of the material, particularly relating to cultural events, hasn't been retained by the people or organisations who created it, as they were kind of documents meant for, a singular event or a singular meeting. But they kind of take on historical significance over time. So that's a snapshot of our archive collections, and we also house library collections. So we have a reference library at BCA that we have in our reading room. So it's a collection of over 8,000 books, including a variety of rare and out of print books. And the library is split into two separate collections. So there's the Black Cultural Archives Library, which is a combination of books kind of amassed by our founders in the early days by going to auction houses, etc., and also donated books. So our kind of community of donors is very much like crucial and in close communication with BCA's staff and BCA as an organisation. So what usually happens is over time, when one of our donors is getting a bit older, they would donate their library collection to us, and we add that to our collections. So our library collections are really crucial to us because actually they're where our archive collections get contextualized. So like I said earlier, our archive, the kind of collecting policy around the archive is for people of African and Caribbean descent in the UK. But in the library collections, that gets expanded out to experiences across the diaspora. And it also contains books around other ethnic minorities in the UK. So not just people of African and Caribbean descent. So in this way, it kind of our library collections can tell the complex histories of migration across the globe. So thinking of UK as not just being an island, but connecting it with other stories across the world. And they kind of provide a framework for stories about our history and ourselves. So we think that telling diverse histories in libraries is important because it reflects the diversity of our lives. And for us, it's where our archive kind of takes on even more historical importance as being rooted in these wider histories. So our reading room and library is now open. So we've kind of put our COVID measures in place, and we're open 3 days a week. So Thursday, Friday and Saturdays. So if anybody is kind of able and is London based, you can come and visit us and visit our collections. Thank you. Oh, how do I stop share? Oh, okay.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks so much, Rhoda. That's really fascinating. I was really struck by the slide you showed at the beginning of Len Garrison's, I didn't write it down the exact words, but his sort of mission about how you have to go out and collect this stuff. And that really proactive mission. So I think for public libraries, it's something really to think through in the way that you've talked about, that it's not just what we might think of as archive material of, beautiful old documents and rare photographs, but also the importance of ephemera, published and printed material. So stuff that we could find in, every public library collection, how collectively that can help tell different stories and different histories as well, and how important that is to your collections. I've got two, I'll just pick up on two specific questions for you, but we'll save most of the questions for the main discussion at the end. So Irina, you asked a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Okay. Hello. Thank you very much for Rhoda for introducing me to the archives that I knew nothing about. So that's great. I've got a question. Well, do you have a digitized catalog? That's one thing.
So could you repeat that?
Do you have a digitized catalog of the collection? Is it available online so that it's possible to search?
Yes, we do. I should have mentioned that. We do have a catalogue online. I'll just get the link and I'll put it in the chat for you.
Okay, great. So, and is it possible to search it via location? Is it possible to narrow it down to this?
I was into search by location, so you can put in keywords.
Yeah.
So if you put the location in as a keyword, it would.
It would. Okay, great. Thank you.
That's okay.
We can send out these links as well afterwards to all the attendees. We can send out an email with a link to the BCA website and the catalogue and so on.
That would be ideal. Thank you.
Brilliant. I'm just conscious of time, so I'd like to move on now to Professor Carolyn Betensky from Rhode Island. So I was really keen that we invited Carolyn to talk because of her work on 19th century and early literature and racist themes within them. I wrote a really, really interesting journal article that Carolyn published, I think it was last year. So again, I'll send around the link to that, where Carolyn reflected on her work with students and how to tackle these themes. So Carolyn, over to you.
Okay, sure. I am, first of all, thank you so much for this invitation. Hello, librarians. You are the best. I just want to say this brief talk I'm about to give is an adaptation of the article that Isabel mentioned, which was titled Casual Racism in Victorian Literature. And I should say that my specialization is in Victorian British literature. And as an American, I was writing for an American context. So that will become apparent, especially at the end of my talk. But I believe that the context is a shared context nationally, culturally. I think it will speak to you as well, but my specific references are to American very recent American history. I begin with a question. What do we do and what might we do when we are faced in a classroom or in a library setting with the banality of racism in classic texts? How do we approach the baseline racism that doesn't surprise us, the kind we expect to find? Scholars in Victorian studies have written extensively about the centrality of colonialism, imperialism, racism, and xenophobia in the production of literary texts. But critics in the field who write about race have largely focused, understandably, on texts that rely thematically or structurally on racist premises or expressions. How do we contend with the pervasive instances of racism that do not dominate our readings of the texts in which they appear? How, in other words, do we remark the unremarkable? Encountering casual racism as often as we do in Victorian texts, and I should say other classic texts, it's not just Victorian. How do we contend with these pervasive instances of racism that, encountering casual racism as often as we do in Victorian texts without a protocol for talking about it leaves us in the position of either having to ignore it, and that's the path of the sophisticated reader, or to pronounce sanctimoniously, repetitively, and unhelpfully upon the Victorians. This is a problem, I argue, that cannot be addressed by recourse to historical contextualization alone. I began thinking in a concerted way about the implications of casual textual racism when I gave a reading with somebody I co-translated a long French novel with, The Mysteries of Paris. It's a novel by Eugene Sue. Some of you may have heard of it or read it even. We translated it from French, and we gave a reading at a bookstore in Washington, DC. And the audience was composed largely of academics, friends, and family members. My co-translator, Jonathan Losberg, and I had decided that I would first give some background about the novel's unusual history, and then he would read from the first chapter. And unexpectedly, I found myself cringing as he read the following passage that occurs near the beginning of the novel. And I've abbreviated all of this a lot. So I'm hoping it holds together. We have all read, this is from Eugene Sue, we have all read the legendary work of the American Walter Scott, James Fenimore Cooper, whose pages describe the brutal ways of savages, their quaint and poetic language, the countless tricks they use to pursue or flee their enemies. Their readers tremble for the welfare of colonists and town dwellers when they consider how they are surrounded by these wild tribes whose bloody ways mark them off from all things civilized. So these were the words I knew intimately from having translated them, yet I felt as if I were experiencing them for the first time as they were pronounced aloud. Was I supposed to be proud of this text? This passage was unabashedly racist, but in the moment I was processing it with really mixed emotions. As a veteran reader of 19th century literature, I knew that Eugene Sue's characterization of Cooper's savages was hardly unique. His racism is unimaginative, yet the banality of Sue's juxtaposition of their brutal and bloody ways to all things civilized did not bring me comfort. Did the other people in the room, including a friend's 9-year-old son who looked up from his video game periodically during the reading, did these other people, did this child understand this passage as run-of-the-mill 19th century racism? And if they did, what did that mean to these people? What if the 9-year-old in the audience had not been my white friend's child, but rather a child of Native American descent? What damage might this casual rhetoric of savagery have caused such a listener? What was it, I asked myself, about the conventionality and the expectedness of this racism that had allowed me not to see it? Or rather, what was it about me? The questions this public reading raised for me had obvious implications for my teaching. That very semester, I was teaching Jane Eyre and Bleak House. I'm assuming these novels need no introduction. Each of these novels featured slurs and stereotypes beyond the ones I had remembered. I had intended to focus on Bertha's racial ambiguity and Jane's imbrication in imperialism when we read Jane Eyre. But a discussion of the racism inherent in Rochester's blackface performance and reception as a gypsy fortune teller, that had not figured in my lesson plan. I had kind of forgotten about it. I mean, I knew the passage, but I hadn't really thought it through quite the way I had about Bertha's racial representation. Of course, I had taught my students. Of course, I was planning on teaching my students about telescopic philanthropy in Bleak House, but I had not expected to field questions about Dickens's demeaning, glancing mentions of the Takahupo Indians. So I wondered, how many times had I not made a point of mentioning the casually racist aspects of texts I had assigned? I couldn't remember ever having consciously, deliberately avoided mentioning them, but I was sure I had let some slurs go unremarked. Unless we were doing close readings of the specific passages in which they had occurred, and unless the trope or argument or information or theme I was trying to bring to students' attention related to these passages, it was highly likely that I had ignored them. Yet there were certainly times when we had discussed racist and xenophobic occurrences in class in the middle of a conversation about something else. Typically, in these instances, I would offer a brief historical context for that racist slur, and then gesture at the differences between Victorian understandings of race and our own. Upon encountering casually racist references, I taught students that the Victorians didn't think the same way about race or other races as we do today. And thus I was implying that 19th century writers couldn't know how wrong they were. By insisting on the historical specificity of Victorian racism and on the difference between Victorian racial thinking and our own, that is, by encouraging students to consider the Victorians less enlightened than ourselves, I had been instructing students to think falsely that we stood in an evolved relationship, not only to Victorian racism, but to racism, period. This is not the way I think when I'm thinking about Victorian or contemporary American racism, but apparently I had not really been thinking. I should just interrupt myself for a second here to say that in the much longer version of this piece, I complicate the term "we" considerably. I just want you to know that, but I left that out here. When we tell our students or other readers in libraries or in our homes or wherever we are, when we tell people that Victorian literature, that Victorian culture was deeply racist and provide historical context for the racism without acknowledging our continuity with this culture, we are effectively portraying our own culture as one that has, to some unexamined degree relative to the Victorians, transcended racism, and equally as one that actually holds itself up to our own standards. So long as white privilege continues to remain the unspoken norm, so long as a sizable percentage of white Americans believe themselves greater victims of racism than members of racial or ethnic minorities, so long as a significant proportion of the American public believes that the notion of Black Lives Mattering is itself racist, so long as these things are true, any confident portrayal of the Victorians, or indeed of any culture of the past, as racist, any such portrayal that does not include an acknowledgement of structural racism in our own moment is decided. Apprehending the banality of Victorian racism requires a different approach, one that addresses it in continuity with the banal, too often unremarked reality of systemic racism in our own time. That is what I have for you.
Ooh. Well, thank you, Carolyn. That's really, really thought-provoking, really thought-provoking. I'm just picking up one comment here from Irina, who's agreeing that she has real issues with Dickens, for example, and also acknowledges that we tend to put our favourite authors on pedestals and maybe focus on the work they did as social reformers around some issues, but gloss over the fact that they may have had racist issues. But I think your point about the continuity of racism and how we have to acknowledge our own, the fact that these ideas and problems pervade our own thinking is really crucial. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on how that might play out in a library context, and the way that this complex thing where the 19th century literature is, still on a pedestal as the classics. Libraries have shelves saying the classics. Many readers love them. They're amazing stories. But at the same time, as you say, how do they play out with different readers and whoever we are? And I think that role of public libraries in helping introduce, being that sort of mediator between readers and novels and how we approach these is really fascinating. Could Karen, could I invite you to, Karen Heathcote, to unmute yourself because you've got an idea there.
Hello, everybody. I just thought it was really interesting to take that, to look at that side of our classic fiction, and thought that it could be a really good subject for debating at readers groups. We try to focus very much on promoting the positive, but sometimes we need to perhaps dig a little into the negative as well. Thank you.
And it's, if you want to talk about positive and negative, it's the negative and the positive intermingled, right? How you talk about these texts that are like really amazing for everybody to read in many ways for many reasons, and yet at the same time they're often laced with the kinds of slurs and moments of casual racism and also explicit, overt, hardcore racism. But I was just talking about more the asides. How do you read texts that are really, you want to encourage people to read these thought-provoking texts, and yet they have these problems at the same time?
Abe, would you like to mute yourself? I think Abe's put a picture into the chat, but you may have to explain what the picture is, Abe, because it doesn't seem to have downloaded in my chat, and others might have problems about it.
All right. Okay. What do we do about libraries where we've got historical statues or figures or artifacts in them? The picture I put up in the chat that you might not be able to see was me taking a selfie at the British Library with the scones statues sort of behind the figureheads. Who donated collections to the British Library. And I had no idea about the relationship that these people had with slavery. And I was there basically taking selfies, thinking these are great philanthropists giving funding to sort of develop these great sort of collections. What do we do about historic things like that?
Rhoda, is that a question that you've been reflecting on at BCA?
Yeah, definitely. I was just going to jump in there, and we've been doing a little bit of work with the Mayor's Commission because they're looking into changing the landscape in that way. And yeah, I mean it's complicated because I guess a lot of the pushback from people is about like remembering our past and not losing sight of all the things that have happened. But there's a question around intention, and there's a question around what some of these statues were erected for, whether it's, these things are being erected with the idea of like teaching and education, or whether, it's actually about remaking the world in your own image, and your image happens to be probably racist and all of the rest of it. But I think what's quite interesting for different institutions, so not only libraries but museums, is that I think when you're dealing with like difficult ideas, and in a way what Carolyn was talking about material that has some really horrible stuff in there, if these works exist within an organization that also is indifferent to racism and other forms of oppression, then actually it's a place where people really do start to feel unsafe. And I think about BCA's library, and we do have a lot of material in there that is inflammatory, because that's the nature of collecting around race in the UK. But we like to think at least that material is contextualized not only by the other archive material that we have, but also by an organization that's quite clear on its stance around racism and other forms of oppression. And maybe that's how, like libraries and other organizations can deal with these histories in the material by having that framework, that organizational framework that's quite clear on its stance.
Great. Carolyn, do you have any reflections on that? This has been a really, really hot debate in the UK over the last 2 or 3 months, since there was a removal of a statue in Bristol. That I don't know if you saw the story over in the States.
Yes, and another statue was put in its place, but removed, right? Isn't that?
Well, the statue was tipped into the harbour.
Right.
It's now being placed in the museum with being preserved with the paint and the damage that happened during the protest and removal. Mm-hmm. So it's been sort of recontextualized within the museum. But it's sparked up a big debate across, big sort of national debate, really, that even the Prime Minister has got involved in on whether statues should be removed or reinterpreted, or how that should work.
Right. Or wasn't there, like, I feel like I read about another sculptor who made a gorgeous statue of a woman who was a protester, a leader of protest.
Yes.
And that lasted like a day or so on that pedestal before it was taken down because it was unauthorized. I really appreciate what Rhoda just said and what they're doing at the archives. I don't have anything original to contribute to this conversation. I just I think I welcome the actions of the protesters and the discourse that's arisen around them.
Great, thank you. So I'm just trawling the the questions as well. John Dolan, would you like to unmute yourself? You've got some comments about sort of core library practice. Really interesting observations.
Hi, hello everybody. Great discussions and experiences from colleagues. Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, I don't know how many here, 40, 50 people, and increasingly cognizant of our own inherent racism. That's the way it is. But you can have benign racism, like I would like to think I am. I'm not cruel or nasty or horrible. As well as aggressive and negative racism, and all that exists in human beings, some of whom are our colleagues. How do we enable people to see the point of view or the points of view that are coming across here in the stock selection? I mean, UK public libraries are full of the kind of material we've been talking about, from Victorian earlier stuff and more recent. So the whole selection, I bet you could go up to many librarians in the UK and they will never have heard of Apples and Snakes, which is a black publisher in the UK. And how do you develop them to be more understanding, more proactive when they're dealing with users, with the stock, and when they're setting up reading groups and managing a reading group where issues like this may come to the fore, or should they bring them to the fore to generate discussion and awareness and learning?
Right, so I don't know, Carolyn or Rhode, if you've got any reflections on that, those points.
First of all, thank you, John. I'm thinking about what you're saying, and also thinking about you kind of talking about individuals working across libraries, and I guess I'm quite interested in organizational frameworks that allow for that difference in individuals, because everybody is kind of on like different journeys in thinking about anti-racist work, and actually being led by the organizations so that there are structures in place that that would mitigate some of that personal bias, and also working with other organizations in terms of like 2020 has been this like eruption of organizing and activism, but there are places and people who have been doing this work. So whether it's about consultation work, trying to tap into those resources that already exist and then slowly embedding them into your organization.
I would add, I don't have a lot of experience in libraries except as a grateful user of resources, but I have been part of an outreach group from the University of Rhode Island called the Movable Feast of Ideas, and we've gone into public libraries to talk about certain texts, including Orwell's 1984. We did that. A colleague of mine and I, we went into like 8 Rhode Island public libraries to talk about it when shortly after Trump was Trump was inaugurated, and we had some really difficult discussions. These discussions were not, I must say, on questions of race, but they were quite difficult because of the polarization of the US, and I think it's really important to create a setting for difficult conversations. We did it. It wasn't always successful. I think we I think we and the people participating in these community discussions really got, some of us got a lot from the discussions. I think some people were left unmoved, but I think community discussions of community problems are appropriate. And the library, I mean, the institution of the library is such a brilliant thing. I'm so glad we still have libraries where you are and where I am. And you know, there's such a generous enterprise in so many ways. The generosity of the very notion of the library, in some way, I think puts people on, maybe this is my fantasy, but somewhat better behavior and able to talk about ideas without ideas and words, and without you know, rushing to positions that are impossible to get past.
Right. I think, yeah, I think absolutely that's the position libraries would like to be in, as this space for quality and thoughtful discussion. I just want to pick up, I think we've got two questions here that really follow on from that, actually. So firstly, could I ask Iona Richardson to share your thoughts, and then to follow on immediately with the question from, Paul Walker. There's sort of two sides of the same coin there. So I think they'd be quite good to hear together before we respond to them. So Iona first.
Hi, thank you so much to the speakers. It's been really interesting, this discussion. My question is more about coming from the public angle. So particularly from my background, I'm in a library borough where we're beginning, certainly as staff, I think, to address the inherent bias and racism that we know we hold. And that does reflect in our collections and the activities that we do. And we're trying specifically to push very hard in leading conversations and in bringing texts and contextualization to our collections. But our public, and given that the public libraries have to be led by public demand, we are, I think, one of the least diverse boroughs in the country. We have a lot of members of public who are actively antagonistic to anti-racist texts and to what they feel is a bias towards anti-racist discussions. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how to integrate what we would consider to be anti-racist and appropriate texts and contextualizations, things like reading groups. We're having a couple of reading groups this week, which we're facilitating, based around Black History Month, based around, we're doing Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race and The Color Purple. And we're trying to get people involved in that, and we are experiencing some resistance. I was just wondering what thoughts you had on maybe trying to wear down those barriers and get people more involved in that contextualization and in that anti-racism within the library, the public library context.
Great, thank you. And could I invite Paul? Paul, would you ask your question? Because I think it's kind of the flip side of that question almost.
Okay. So yeah, quick. So yeah, to say thank you for this. This is really useful. Quick context for my question is that I was once running a one-off reading group about Angela Y. Davis, and I was asked to cancel it because of being a white man running that group and that being seen as inappropriate, which gave me a lot to think about. So I wondered if there's any tips for like running anti-racist groups in an appropriate way. And I can see other pitfalls, like, you know, people maybe saying insensitive things in a public space and so on. So any tips for running public anti-racist reading groups would be appreciated. Thanks a lot.
So, Rhode and Carolyn, I don't know if either of you have thoughts to respond to those really challenging questions.
Rhoda, you go first.
I was like, you go, Carolyn. All right. So I will pick up on Paul's point. Thank you, Paul, about running anti-racist reading groups. And I wonder whether it's a bit about framing, in the sense that I think right now, something like really positive that's happening is that like a lot of white people are kind of running like reading groups and training around anti-racist work, specifically actually to kind of put pressure off of Black people and other people of color from potentially like entering spaces that are just like exhausting and like maybe a bit boring. So in that way, maybe it's about being clear about your position, and again going back to what Isabel was saying about like neutrality, kind of not acting as a neutral actor, and kind of saying that, you know, a reading group is coming from like a space of learning, and it's coming from a space of like trying to undo some of these subjectivities. So that's like one point that I would make potentially, but it also sounds like maybe you had like an interesting, like the experience itself was somehow revealing or useful in certain ways. And then thinking about Iona's question, which I think is like really, really complicated actually, and really bears a lot of thinking about. But I guess my initial thoughts are around you know, your public as like one block, and whether it's about your like vocal public in a sense, or whether those ideas are actually reflective of everybody who's using your services, like whether or not there's, you know, like a little bit of bias or inequality happening there in terms of, you know, like who shouts the loudest is often heard. And trying to speak to, you know, people who use your services who may not actually feel those ways, and also may find that debate to be like really really sad and really difficult. And also, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. It's difficult. I'm going to pass to Carolyn.
Yeah. So, you know, the university I teach at is, I mean, Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island is not as diverse ethnically, racially as some other states. And I frequently I face classrooms of mostly white faces. And I have gotten some pushback, I will say, speaking to Iona's point or question. And I've also been in a position a little bit like, I mean, I don't mean to presume, but I think I can relate to what Paul was saying. I think that to speak first to Iona's question, I think, you know, I think you said that you were reading The Color Purple, and I think it's really important to do as much reading of texts by Black people, people of color, in reading groups, and because you can use the power of the idea of the classic, teach classic texts by people of color instead of texts by, sorry, not teach, forgive me, that's my context. Have reading groups discuss text by, you know, as many people of color as you can feature. There are so many incredible books to teach. I saw somebody said something about, you know, not just during Black History Month. Exactly, right? As much as possible, and harness the power of the idea of the classic. And if you're teaching classic literary texts, right, you know, that the kind of prestige of classicness does some of your work for you. It defuses some of the pushback, because people who have reservations about the value of, or reservations they might not even recognize that they have about the value of Black experience, or whatever their issues are, if they're framed in a discussion of a brilliant work of literature, if you're talking about literature, some of that goes away, and the people who have the problems are forced to contend with the fact of the brilliant literary work. And so some of the brilliance and anti-racism, I think, seep in. And anyway, that's one thing I would say. And then to Paul's experience, I would just say, as myself, a white person who's very committed to anti-racist work, I feel like it's important to learn how to, what it means to be like a white person in this context. And sometimes it means stepping back and not, I mean, I'm sure you already had this experience. I'm not, I get that, but it's part of the territory of, the legacy of oppression, is that those of us who have benefited from our structural position are, we're gonna have to contend with that legacy and just not get upset when our own position is challenged for something that we're surprised we're being challenged on. That's all. I mean, I get it, but it's important to do this work. That's what I'd say.
Isabel, we can't hear you.
Thank you. Sorry, I've got a little switch on my microphone. Thanks for saying that. I was just saying that we've got loads more questions and ideas in the chat we could pick up on, but unfortunately we've gone beyond the end of our hour now, so we'll have to finish. But I just want to say an enormous thank you to Rhode and Carolyn for opening up such a really crucial debate. And, I think really switching our brains onto the fact that public libraries really are all about the past and supporting ourselves and our communities to think about the past and how it shapes the present and the future. I think those words of Len Garrison about being proactive to go out there and collect and interpret really are a great sort of mantra to finish on. So thank you very much, everybody. And we'll follow up with sending you some links and including a link to the recording if that's something you want to share with friends and colleagues. So thank you, speakers, and enormous thank you also to audiences, real energetic participants in the event today. So thank you.